Have you ever just, stopped and thought about how interconnected everything is? Global history, I mean. How stuff that happened centuries ago, like way off somewhere else, is still shaping things today.
Oh, absolutely. It echoes right into our economies, our cultures, geopolitics.
Yeah.
It's all woven together.
It really is. It's like this huge, complicated web. And sometimes to figure out where we are now, you've got to go back. Right, back to the start.
Exactly. Trace those threads.
So that's what we're doing today. We're embarking on a deep dive into, well, one of the biggest threads in that whole tapestry, the relationship between the British Empire and India.
A relationship spanning centuries, tumultuous, transformative,
Yeah,
definitely dramatic.
totally. And this isn't just like a history lesson with dates. It's this epic story starting with trade, then these massive power struggles, incredible resistance, and finally, independence. But even that was so complicated and painful.
Mm-hmm.
It's packed with those aha moments,
Mm.
the kind that help you understand global dynamics, economic gaps, even cultural stuff we see all around us.
It really is crucial context for the modern world.
Right. So our mission here is to unpack the whole thing, starting from the very first contacts, which seem pretty harmless at first glance, and then trace how British influence grew, how it shifted leading up to independence, and tragically, partition.
And we've got a good range of sources to draw on, trying to give that balanced view of the key events, the people involved, and the impacts.
Yeah, we've really tried to pull together a comprehensive look.
What's really fascinating, I think, is watching how centuries of interaction, starting as just business, really laid the groundwork for so much of what defines the region and even the world today.
It's not just about India and Britain, is it?
Not at all. It's about power, colonial economics, how nations get formed after empire, all of that. India itself went through these huge irreversible changes.
Yeah.
And understanding this story is key to understanding both countries, South Asia, and like you said, the modern interconnected world. It's complex, there was immense human cost, and the legacies, well, they're still very much alive.
Couldn't agree more. So let's do it. Let's go back, way back, to the very beginning. 1. The dawn of influence. Early contact and the East India Company. 1600, 1757. Okay, so let's dive in. We're kicking off our journey way back, 1600.
Right at the start.
Exactly. Picture England, Queen Elizabeth I is on the throne, and they're really looking outwards, expanding their reach, trying to tap into all that legendary wealth of the East.
Spices, textiles, the whole lot.
Yeah.
The fabled riches.
For sure. And in that year, 1600, something happens that seems kind of small at the time, just an administrative thing, really.
New piece of paper almost.
Yeah.
A royal charter.
Yeah, exactly. Queen Elizabeth grants this charter to a brand new company, the British East India Company, the EIC.
The famous EIC.
And initially, their job sounds simple enough, right? Just trade. Go trade with the East Indies.
Purely commercial. That was the mandate.
That was the idea. Spices, textiles. But, well, what started as just business was about to become something. Something much, much bigger. An empire builder, really.
And that's where the story starts taking these, well, unexpected turns. In those early days, say the 1500s, early 1700s, the EIC was mostly about trade.
It's buying and selling.
Pretty much. They set up these little outposts, factories, they call them, in key port cities, places like Surat, Madras, Bombay, Calcutta.
Right, but not factories like we think of them today, not making things.
No, good point. Not industrial factories. Think more like fortified compounds, warehouses, offices, living quarters for the company staff, maybe some walls for defense.
Ah, okay, like little trading hubs.
Exactly. Bustling hubs, but kind of self-contained British bubbles within these bigger Indian cities. They have their own guards, their own rules, operating almost on their own terms.
Interesting. So they're collecting goods there.
Yep. Textiles, spices, indigo dye, later on, opium, which becomes hugely controversial, getting it all ready for the long trip back to Britain.
So these weren't just warehouses then. They were like footholds.
Precisely. Economic footholds, yes, but also these little pockets of influence. And they allowed the company to start projecting power, even if just locally at first. That all seems pretty benign, just commerce. But it's setting the stage, subtly, for much deeper entanglement. Economic first, then political.
And it didn't take that long for things to get, political, did it? They started moving beyond just trade pretty quickly.
They did. The EIC realized there was a lot to gain by getting involved in local Indian politics. Interfering, you might say.
How did they manage that, a company getting involved in politics?
Well, they figured out a pretty effective, if maybe cynical strategy, playing Indian rulers against each other.
Seriously, like pitting them against one another.
Yeah. It sounds like something out of, a political thriller, but that was their approach.
But why? What was the motivation for a trading company to do that?
Oh, well, fundamentally, more profit. Always more profit. They wanted monopolies. They wanted to shut out competitors, other Europeans like the French and Dutch, but also Indian merchants.
Okay, so classic business tactics, maybe.
Sort of, but on a geopolitical scale. And you have to remember the context in India at the time. The Mughal Empire, once incredibly powerful, was fragmenting.
Right, it wasn't one unified state anymore.
Exactly. You had lots of regional kingdoms, local rulers, all kind of vying for power, sometimes fighting amongst themselves. The EIC saw this instability, these divisions, as an opportunity.
An opportunity for what?
To gain leverage. They had money, they had organization, they even had their own small disciplined armies initially, just for defending their factories, remember?
Yeah.
So they could offer support, money, weapons, even troops to one side against another, and in return, they'd get fantastic trade deals, exclusive rights, maybe get rid of some local competition.
Wow, so they're exploiting internal conflicts for commercial gain.
Pretty much. It's quite something how a company managed to build up so much political and military clout just by being ruthless and opportunistic in this complex environment.
And this whole strategy, this kind of creeping interference, it all comes to a head, doesn't it, at a place called Plassey?
Yes. The Battle of Plassey, 1757. This is absolutely pivotal. Not just another battle, a real watershed moment.
What happened there?
The EIC forces, led by Robert Clive, the key figure, defeated Siraj-ud-Dowlah, the Nawab or ruler of Bengal. Bengal was incredibly wealthy.
And the British just won militarily.
Well, yes, but that's not the whole story. A huge factor, maybe the deciding factor, was betrayal. Mir Jafar, one of the Nawab's own commanders, switched sides. He was promised the throne if the British won.
Wow. So intrigue played a massive part.
A massive part. In Plassey, it wasn't just a military win. It marks the real start of British political control, proper territorial control in India.
So before this, they were traders with influence. But after this?
After this, they're kingmakers, power brokers. The symbolism is huge. Military force, yes, but combined with cunning, manipulation, betrayal. That's what won the day, more than just battlefield tactics.
A trading company essentially taking over a province.
Effectively, yes, one of the richest provinces in the world. From this point on, the EIC isn't just a business. It's installing rulers, dictating terms, extracting wealth. It changed everything. Their ambitions clearly went way beyond just trade now. 2. The company Raj. Exploitation and expansion, 1757-1858.
Okay, so Plassey is the turning point. The EIC is now a political power in Bengal. And they didn't hang about, did they? They moved fast to consolidate that.
No, they moved very quickly. Just 8 years later, 1765, they secured something called the Diwani rights from the Mughal emperor.
Diwani rights, what exactly does that mean?
It sounds technical, but it was monumental. It gave the EIC the right to collect the taxes from Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa. Huge, fertile, wealthy areas.
So a private company is now collecting taxes for an entire region.
Essentially, yes. And the implications were just profound. Think about it. Before this, the EIC had to pay for Indian goods, spices, textiles, whatever, with silver and gold shipped from Britain.
Right, which cost them money.
Exactly. It was a drain on Britain. But with the Diwani, they could collect vast sums of money in India from Indian land and trade.
Ah, so they could use Indian money.
To buy Indian goods, exactly. They could fund their own operations, pay their growing army, and buy the goods they wanted to export, all without sending bullion from Britain.
That's incredible. They're basically getting goods for free from Britain's point of view.
Pretty much. It turned India into this land exploited for revenue extraction on a massive scale. It's like mercantilism supercharged by a corporation. They weren't just taking resources. They were using India's own wealth to finance the removal of more wealth.
Fueling Britain's economy, presumably.
Hugely. This flow of wealth contributed significantly to Britain's Industrial Revolution. Indian capital fueling British factories. It was a massive, self-sustaining drain on India.
And with all this new money, I assume their military ambitions grew as well.
Absolutely. More revenue meant a bigger, better-equipped army, and they used it. The period after 1765 saw a systematic campaign of military conquest and expansion across India.
Taking more territory.
Yes, aggressively. They targeted rival powers. Think about the defeat of Tipu Sultan of Mysore in 1799.
He was a major opponent, wasn't he? The Tiger of Mysore.
A very formidable opponent. Innovative, fiercely independent. His defeat was a huge symbol of growing British dominance. And then maybe even more significantly, they took on the Maratha Confederacy,
Who were they?
a powerful network of states controlling large parts of central and western India. They were a major force. The British fought several wars against them and finally crushed the Confederacy by about 1818.
And what did that mean?
That meant British control, direct or indirect, over most of the Indian subcontinent was now basically cemented. There were very few independent powers left that could seriously challenge them.
So these weren't just random wars, it was strategic.
Oh, entirely strategic. You connect the dots. It was a systematic campaign. Eliminate rivals, secure resources, gain strategic depth. Tipu's defeat removed a major obstacle. Defeating the Marathas neutralized the biggest remaining power block. It was relentless expansionism, driven by that desire for total economic and political control.
But it wasn't just about conquest and taxes, was it? Didn't the company also introduce changes like education, railways?
Yes, they did. And this is where the narrative gets complicated. The company Raj did see the introduction of things like English education, the beginnings of that vast railway network, telegraph system.
Which sounds like progress, right? Modernization.
On the surface, yes, but it's a classic double-edged sword. These innovations happened alongside massive economic exploitation and devastating famines.
Famines, plural.
Oh, yes, recurring terrible famines. We'll come back to those. But even the improvements,
Yeah.
you have to ask why they were introduced. Who did they primarily benefit?
Okay, so the railways.
Crucial for moving raw materials, cotton, jute, indigo, from the interior to the ports, fast, for export to Britain. And just as important, for moving cheap British manufactured goods into India, which often destroyed local industries like textiles.
Ah, so it helped British industry both ways.
Precisely. And railways were also vital for moving troops quickly to crush any unrest. Control.
And English education.
Well, the main aim was to create a class of Indians who could help run the administration cheaply and efficiently. Clerks, lower-level officials, loyal intermediaries, people sometimes called them brown sahibs. It wasn't really about mass education or empowering Indian thought for its own sake.
So tools of control, essentially, even the good things.
Largely, yes, that's the critical perspective. Were they advancements for India, or tools for more efficient British rule and extraction? The evidence points strongly towards the latter, though, yes, some of that infrastructure would later be used by independent India. But the primary intent seems clear. 3. The fury unleashed. The Revolt of 1857, First War of Independence.
Okay, so you've got this situation. Decades of exploitation, land being taken, industries ruined, cultural clashes, disrespect. It feels like something had to give.
And it did. Dramatically.
Yeah.
In 1857, all that simmering resentment just exploded into what the British call the Sepoy Mutiny, but what many in India call the First War of Independence.
Right. And it wasn't just one single thing that caused it, was it? You described it earlier as a perfect storm.
Exactly. It was a culmination. Decades of grievances boiling over. Let's unpack it a bit.
Okay.
One immediate trigger, the famous one, was about military practices. New rifle cartridges.
The greased cartridges, right.
Yes. The rumor spread like wildfire among the sepoys, the Indian soldiers in the company's army, that these cartridges, which they had to bite open to load, were greased with pig and cow fat.
Which would be deeply offensive to both Muslims and Hindus.
Hugely offensive. A direct assault on their religious beliefs. Pork for Muslims, beef for Hindus. It felt like a deliberate attempt to defile them, maybe even forcibly convert them.
But that was just the spark.
It was the spark that lit the fuse, yes. But the powder keg was already full. There were broader fears about religious interference. Missionaries seemed to be getting more active. British laws were changing things like inheritance and adoption customs.
Undermining traditions.
Right. Then the economic hardship. Those land revenue policies, they were brutal. High taxes, inflexible collection meant many farmers lost their land, fell into debt. Generations of ownership wiped out.
And the destruction of industries, we meant.
Yes, weavers, artisans. Millions lost their livelihoods as cheaper British goods flooded the market. Widespread poverty and desperation.
And politically.
Deep resentment over how Indian rulers were treated. Kingdoms annexed, sometimes on flimsy pretexts using policies like the doctrine of lapse, treaties ignored, princes and nobles stripped of their traditional status and pensions. Just a profound lack of respect.
So it's cultural, religious, economic, political, everything coming together.
There's a potent mix. Cultural arrogance, economic pressure, political high-handedness. It all boiled over.
And when it erupted, who were the key figures leading the resistance?
There were many. Across different regions, some truly iconic figures emerged. Rani Lakshmibai, the Queen of Shanzi, she's legendary, fought incredibly bravely against the British.
I think I've heard of her.
Probably. Then there was Mangal Pandey, a sepoy whose initial act of defiance against his officers is often seen as one of the very first sparks. And Bahadur Shah Zafar, the elderly, almost powerless last Mughal emperor in Delhi.
The Mughal emperor. But I thought the empire had declined.
It had, hugely. But he was still a powerful symbol. The rebels rallied around him, making him a figurehead for restoring Indian rule. It gave the revolt a sense of legitimacy, even if he had little real power himself.
And the revolt itself. How widespread was it?
It spread rapidly across large parts of north and central India. Major cities like Delhi, Lucknow, Kanpur became centers of rebellion. It was a massive challenge to British authority. They genuinely feared they might lose India.
How did the British respond?
With overwhelming, often incredibly brutal force. The suppression was ruthless. Mass executions, villages burned, terrible atrocities committed on both sides. But the British response was systematic and aimed at total pacification, a very dark chapter.
So the revolt was ultimately crushed.
Yes, militarily, the British regained control. But the impact was immense. It completely shook the British establishment. They realized the EIC couldn't handle India anymore.
A wake-up call.
A massive wake-up call. And for India, while it was brutally suppressed, it became this foundational event in the narrative of nationalism, a symbol of shared resistance against foreign rule. That's why it's remembered as the First War of Independence. It showed the British their rule wasn't accepted and wouldn't go unchallenged. 4. The jewel in the crown. British Crown Rule, 1858-1947, the Raj.
Okay, so 1857 changes everything. The British government steps in, takes direct control from the East India Company.
Exactly. The revolt made it crystal clear that governing India was too big, too important, and frankly too dangerous to leave to a private company, even one as powerful as the EIC had become. So in 1858, the Government of India Act transferred all the EIC's powers and territories directly to the British Crown.
And India officially becomes the jewel in the crown.
That phrase really captures it. It wasn't just another colony. It was seen as the most valuable, prestigious part of the entire British Empire. Strategically vital, economically crucial.
And they cemented that symbolically too, right, with Queen Victoria.
Yes, in 1877, Queen Victoria was proclaimed Empress of India. That was the very deliberate act, binding India directly to the British monarchy, emphasizing that it was now an integral part of the empire ruled directly from London.
So the Raj begins. Direct rule by the British state. Did things change much on the ground for Indians?
Well, the governance structure changed. You had a viceroy representing the crown, a more formalized administration, but many of the underlying dynamics continued, or even intensified.
Like the infrastructure projects, did they keep building railways and things?
Oh yes, the railway network extended massively under crown rule. Post, telegraphs, irrigation projects, they all continued and grew.
But still with that same underlying motive, serving British interests.
Largely, yes, that critique remains valid. Railways were still primarily about moving resources out, goods in, and troops around. Irrigation sometimes helped agriculture, sure, but often prioritized cash crops for export over food security for locals.
Right. Resources out, control maintained.
That was the core logic. And control became even more sophisticated in some ways.
How so?
Well, one of the most infamous strategies really honed during the Raj was divide and rule.
We touched on that briefly. How did it work in practice?
It was insidious. The British administration consciously played on existing divisions within Indian society, religious divisions, especially between Hindus and Muslims, but also caste divisions, regional differences.
How did they play on them?
By, for example, using separate electorates for different religious groups in local councils, which encouraged people to think and vote along religious lines. By showing favoritism to one group over another in government jobs or education. By writing histories that emphasized past conflicts between communities.
So deliberately deepening fault lines.
Exactly. Making sure Indians saw themselves as Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs, or members of a particular caste or region first, rather than as Indians united against British rule. It weakened potential opposition.
That sounds incredibly cynical.
It was a deliberate political strategy, and it had devastating long-term consequences. This raises that important question, doesn't it, about how political tactics can just poison societies for generations.
Yeah, sowing seeds of conflict.
Which would bear bitter fruit later, particularly during partition.
And amidst all this political maneuvering and infrastructure building, what about the people's basic welfare? You mentioned famines earlier. Did those continue under the Raj?
Tragically, yes. Some of the worst famines in Indian history occurred during the period of direct British Crown rule.
Worse than under the company?
Arguably, yes, in terms of scale and frequency in the later 19th century. Think about the Great Famine of 1876-78, another massive one in 1899-1900. Millions died. And then the horrific Bengal famine as late as 1943 during World War II.
1943, that's so recent. What caused these? Just bad weather.
Weather often played a part, triggering droughts or floods.